we're moving on to the story that doesn't stop giving, and that is the doom spiral of the Iran war. And, something really remarkable is happening in this case, because I want to note that U.S. forces are being repositioned out of the Arab Gulf as a result of this war, at least for now. You have a drawdown at El Udeid in Qatar, an accelerated pullout in Iraq, troops shuffled to Jordan and Israel, where in Jordan's case, they've actually become a magnet for Iranian fire and a lightning rod for public anger, with hundreds of activists and public figures signing a letter telling the Americans to go home. For years, we were told the U.S. military footprint in the region was permanent, untouchable, the bedrock of the whole order. And yet here we are watching Washington shrink its presence under pressure and watching the Gulf monarchies, the supposedly loyal clients, quietly tell the White House what they will and won't tolerate when it comes to the war with Iran, which, by the way, I should note, and this is according to Al Jazeera, they're saying that the U.S. is saying that a deal to open Hormuz is possible today or tomorrow. I mean, we've heard these kinds of things before. We'll see how that plays out. Are they going to sign another memorandum of understanding? Who knows? But to find out what actually is going on here, specifically with regard to the Arab Gulf states, who's driving this? Tehran, Riyadh, their events themselves, and what does the region look like on the other side of this war if we ever get there? To help us make sense of it all, we're joined by Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics, a geopolitical risk consultancy in Washington. And Giorgio is one of our favorite recurring guests here at Breakthrough News. Giorgio, welcome back to the show.
Hey, good to be with you too.
It's great to be on with you. And there's so much we want to talk about here with regards to the Arab Gulf states, which you write about all over the place. People should follow all of your work. Your analysis is top notch. But I wanted to start off here by just noting something that I think is quite significant, which I mentioned in the intro, and that is that the Iranian retaliatory strikes on U.S. assets in Bahrain and Kuwait have actually pushed the U.S. to reposition forces to Jordan, Israel, and elsewhere. And like I mentioned, that has provoked anger in Jordan now that it's become especially the main target of Iranian fire throughout this round of I guess, the restart of this war. There's also been a major drawdown, like I mentioned, from Al Udeid in Qatar, and this accelerated withdrawal in Iraq, which of course was part of a prior agreement, but has been sped up by the tensions. And all of this does read, at least temporarily, as Iran achieving one of its central demands, which is this drawdown of U.S. military assets from the region. I'm just curious, before we move into some specifics around tangential to this, how do you understand that repositioning? Is it significant or is it just temporary? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. Always a privilege to be guest on Breakthrough News. I think we should draw a distinction between a U.S. retreat from the region and a repositioning that's going on. While you can make an exception maybe for Iraq due to a pre-existing withdrawal, what we're seeing really is a redistribution of risk, a repositioning where the U.S. military, I think, is really trying to move away from the Gulf, at least temporarily, a measure aimed at reducing harm to U.S. troops. And in this sense, I don't think we can claim that Iran is achieving its objective of kicking the United States military out of the region. But what we should note, though, is that this is advancing an Iranian interest in increasing the costs for the U.S. of waging attacks on Iran. That is clear. And also for many, many years, Iran has tried to convince Arab countries that hosting U.S. bases and installations comes with very serious risks. And going to this point you're making about the recent developments in Jordan, I think Iran is certainly having some success in driving that point home. So again, while short of achieving Iran's real objective, which is to basically eject the U.S. military from the neighborhood, there certainly are some gains that I think Iran considers itself to be making right now.
In just this weekend, the Wall Street Journal reported that Trump paused a new round of strikes on Iran after Gulf allies pushed back. MBS personally called him, urging diplomacy, and mediators reported progress on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. But the Gulf, it seems, was split. The UAE was pushing Trump to go hard, urging decisive military force. And underneath it all, the reporting describes Gulf governments as frustrated and anxious, bearing the brunt of Iranian retaliation while seeing no clear strategy from the United States. So Trump suspending these strikes after a call from Riyadh, is that the Gulf actually using its leverage over U.S. policy, or is it Trump doing what he was going to do anyways while the Gulf states are still absorbing the consequences of a war they can't control? And what does this episode tell us about their post-war relationship with Iran?
Yeah, so definitely there's a few questions there together, and I think it might be a little difficult to really provide definitive answers here to all of these questions. I would say that probably Saudi influence in the Trump administration is one factor, but I would be hesitant to say it's sort of the decisive factor. What we do know, really going back to the start of this conflict, is that the Trump administration has had no problem disregarding Saudi Arabia's security concerns. Saudi Arabia, along with other GCC states and Turkey, tried very hard to convince the Trump administration to not start this war back in February, and the Trump administration disregarded their warnings, their concerns, and totally aligned the US with Netanyahu's government in deciding to wage this war. So right now, obviously, the Saudis are fearful of further escalation, and they're trying to use their influence in Washington, which, again, to the point I just made, clearly has serious limits. Nonetheless, they're trying to influence the Trump administration to move in the direction of de-escalation rather than intensifying hostilities toward on Iran. But there are other factors unrelated to Saudi or Gulf influence that I think matter. There's these issues of ammunition shortages. There are the political costs that the Trump administration has to pay for rising number of U.S. military casualties. That's a sensitive political issue here in the United States. There's, of course, the economic impact of this conflict with the Strait of Hormuz, now the Bab el-Mandeb, closed off. And we have the midterm elections coming up in November. The Trump administration, I think, does not want to see this conflict continue, let alone expand, which it is. All of this is to say, I think Trump had his own interests in avoiding escalation, and I would be cautious about excessively attributing that to Saudi Arabia's influence over the administration.
No, much appreciated. And, to keep it on Saudi Arabia, which we are for the next couple questions here, I wanted to ask you with regard to the fact that last month the U.S. and Saudi Arabia signed this civilian nuclear cooperation deal. Then a day later, Trump went on Truth Social and he declared the whole thing totally subject to Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. That was a condition added on after the signing, apparently to make the Israelis happy because they were upset and they don't want anything happening without everybody joining the Abraham Accords. They were pretty furious about that deal. So what's the significance both of the deal itself and of Trump publicly holding it hostage to normalization?
Well, Saudi Arabia does have nuclear ambitions, and nuclear energy is important to Saudi Arabia's vision for diversifying its economy away from oil in line with the grandiose agenda of Vision 2030. This is nothing new. We've known about this for years. I think that the landmark agreement that was announced last month needs to be understood largely within the context of the U.S. interest in countering Chinese and Russian influence in the Middle East, specifically in the Gulf. Obviously, China and Russia have their nuclear programs, and Saudi Arabia, which maintains good relations with Beijing and Moscow, has the option of working with China and Russia when it comes to advancing its nuclear ambitions. And I think in this day and age of great power competition, when the world is becoming more multipolar, the Trump administration wants to see to it that if Saudi Arabia pursues its nuclear ambitions, it's the United States, not China nor Russia, that really has influence over the Saudi nuclear program. At the same time, Trump is always keen to present himself as this president who goes to bat for large US companies and secures lucrative deals for them. And there's no doubt that this deal was going to open up the door for decades of partnership between certain US firms and the Saudis when it comes to nuclear cooperation. So that is definitely typical Trump. What's also typical Trump is to do these constant 180s, take everyone by surprise. And the fact that the following day, he said that this agreement depends on Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. That took the Saudis by surprise. That was not a part of the agreement. The Saudis have made it very clear that under current conditions, they will not join the Abraham Accords. There have to be irreversible steps toward the establishment of a Palestinian state in order for Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords. Anyone who knows anything about the current Israeli government or the current political climate in Israel knows that there's really no reason to imagine Israel taking irreversible steps toward the establishment of a Palestinian state, meaning that any talk of Riyadh joining the Israeli normalization camp is just completely disconnected from reality. What happens to that agreement going forward? The Trump administration said that they're committed to talking about all these issues with the Saudis. I think either the Trump administration has to later drop that condition of Saudi-Israeli normalization, or this deal is not going to go ahead. But I do not think that Saudi Arabia is going to join the Abraham Accords just because Trump said that that's necessary for this deal to go forward. And again, bringing me back to the point from a moment ago, Saudi Arabia does have other options. They can work with the Chinese and Russians. I think that's probably something people in Washington would be wise to consider.
Well, yeah.
Well, Israel also keeps signaling, as we've all watched throughout this war, that after Iran, they are quite ambitious about their next targets. They keep mentioning Turkey. They're now increasingly saying Qatar is next. A few of the Israeli leaders have mentioned Saudi Arabia could be next at some point. So has that shifted Saudi calculations here, Giorgio? We also saw Riyadh recently escalate against Ansar Allah in Yemen, and then they joined the U.S. in striking PMF fighters in Iraq last week. But then Saudi is also trying to balance that hawkishness against its very real fear of an unstable Israeli-dominated region. And you wrote recently about how that plays out in Lebanon, which is what I wanted to really ask you about. And, I wanted to push on the framing a bit because your piece argues that Riyadh actually rejects both an Iranian and an Israeli sphere of influence in Lebanon, and that it wants Lebanese state sovereignty as a hedge against Israeli hegemony, not in service of it. But, over here in Lebanon, a lot of people feel that the Saudi machinations in the Lebanese political scene are actually reinforcing Israeli hegemony over Lebanon. So can you elaborate on your argument there? And what does that shift say about Saudi plans for the region more broadly?
Yeah, I think maybe a good starting point here is September of last year, September 2025, when Israel's borderless aggression started to target the GCC with Tel Aviv's act of international aggression against Doha. At that moment, we saw Saudi Arabia begin to increasingly view Israel as a direct threat to Saudi Arabia. Up until then, Israel's attacks on the Palestinian territories after October 7th, Lebanon and Syria too, and also Yemen, were seen from Saudi Arabia's perspective as driving instability. But when the Israelis attacked Doha in September. That was an attack on a GCC country. And I think from the Saudi perspective and the perspective of others in the GCC, it was an attack not just on Doha, but really an attack on the GCC as an institution. And the tensions between Israel and Saudi Arabia have certainly heated up since October 7th. And there are concerns in Saudi Arabia about Israel potentially waging a military operation against the kingdom at some point in the future. All of this is to say that Saudi Arabia is increasingly worried about Israel's behavior in the region. And we are seeing Saudi Arabia put more diplomatic energy into this informal geopolitical bloc that I discuss in the article you reference, often called the Islamic Quad. This is made up of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey, and Pakistan. These countries share an interest in seeing to it that the American-Israeli war on Iran does not lead to more instability and toxic spillover effects in the region. And they also want to see Israeli aggression checked and put in place. And within this context, Saudi Arabia does have concerns about what Israel is doing in Lebanon. As everyone knows, you certainly know better than I do, for decades, Saudi Arabia has perceived Hezbollah as a threat. Like other Gulf Arab monarchies, the view is that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, an arm of Iran. And we saw, especially, I think, really after the Arab Spring, up until the renormalization of Saudi-Iranian relations in March 2023, Saudi Arabia definitely put a lot of pressure on Lebanon in an effort to really weaken the Shia organization. So there definitely is a perception that Saudi Arabia has of the group as a threat, but that is not to say that Riyadh believes that Israel's military campaign in Lebanon is something that should be welcomed. The Saudis, I think, want to see with this current government in Beirut a political order that is friendly to Saudi Arabia and the other GCC states. And they certainly do want to see Iranian influence decreased and be limited inside Lebanon. They want to see Lebanon's government work closely with the post-Assad government in Damascus as well. And they want to basically see a certain kind of order stabilize in Lebanon that is friendly to Saudi Arabia's interests. Their view, however, is that what Israel is doing is a threat to that vision. And they ultimately believe that Israel's behavior in Lebanon is going to, if anything, empower Hezbollah in ways that will undermine Saudi Arabia's interests. So basically, Saudi Arabia wants to see Lebanese institutions prevail rather than see Israel's occupation become a permanent reality in southern Lebanon. And they also want to see Iran be much less of an influential actor in Lebanon. Whether any of this is realistic is another question. I think there's good reason to fear that Israel's occupation will become more entrenched and permanent, and that Iran's influence in Lebanon is not on the verge of coming to an end. But nonetheless, this is what Saudi Arabia would like to see. To make the point again, whether that's realistic, that's a whole other question. But in my article, I tried to sort of shed light on the perspective that Riyadh has on Israel's aggression toward Lebanon.
Well, it's certainly an interesting perspective, and it's others would argue that in its nature, Israel will always pursue this kind of policy that would disrupt any possibility of sovereignty. But before we let you go, Giorgio, wanted to get your thoughts on this. Oman just sent its National Security Council chief to Beijing. So a security level visit. You've written that the Iran war is pushing smaller Gulf states to diversify their partnerships, deepening ties with China without fully breaking from Washington. Though, as you put it, the real question isn't whether Oman is drifting towards China, but why is U.S. policy doing so much of the pushing? Is Oman the leading edge of a broader Gulf trend here? And how much room is Washington actually going to give these states to hedge?
Well, it's really risky for you to ask a question like this and then try to kick me off in only about 2 minutes from now because there's so much to
Take your
say.
time.
But what I think is important to note is that there have been some tensions that have mounted between Oman and the Trump administration. Um, Oman has historically been a diplomatic bridge between Washington and Tehran. When the Obama administration negotiated the JCPOA, for example, Oman played a critical role in facilitating the talks that eventually led to that watershed nuclear agreement. Um, but there have been certain groups, certain neoconservative and pro Israel groups in Washington who have been very suspicious of Oman's relationship with Iran. They have argued that Oman is too close to Iran to be considered a GCC member in good standing, or at least a reliable US partner in the Arab world. It seems that those narratives about Oman as a country that's too close to Iran have successfully convinced some in the Trump administration that this is the case. And when Oman earlier this year was in talks with Iran about a new arrangement for the Strait of Hormuz, Trump famously, outrageously threatened to quote unquote blow up Oman, depending on how the country acts in relation to the Strait of Hormuz. So, from the Omani perspective, if you're depending on the United States as your security guarantor, which Oman has for decades, but then there's an American president who is threatening to blow up your country, it's fair to ask questions about what, in practice, is the utility of the American security umbrella. Also, let's keep in mind that Oman, granted, to a lesser degree than the other five GCC states, but still Oman has suffered from attacks on its territory during this American-Israeli war on Iran. So this is all to say that Oman is losing confidence in the American security guarantees. The challenge for Oman, though, like other GCC states, is that there is not any other power in the world that is capable and willing to replace the United States as a security guarantor for the GCC members. So Oman, I think, is going to definitely continue working closely with the United States. Relationships are very much about institutions, not just about individual leaders in the White House. So Oman is not looking to walk away from the United States. In fact, Oman is very committed to the partnership, but Oman is trying to diversify its relationships. This is not new. Oman has long valued its autonomy and independence and wanted to avoid being totally dependent on the US or any other power. So diversification of alliances and partnerships is something Oman has been doing for many years, for decades. But in the context of this current war, Oman is trying to accelerate its efforts to diversify relations and become more autonomous from the United States. And it's within this context that Oman is engaged in this outreach to China. And I think Oman is going to try to deepen its relationship with Beijing across many domains to sort of adapt to a more multipolar world and become less dependent on the United States. Of course, I think there will be limits to the extent to which Oman and China can deepen their relationship. But at the same time, I think Muscat and Beijing have quite a bit of synergy that will lead them to cooperate in many respects. China has huge stakes in the Strait of Hormuz being open. China, I think, really believes very strongly in diplomatic solutions to problems in the Middle East. And Oman has a very solid track record of being an effective diplomatic bridge in the region and promoting dialogue aimed at helping countries in the region reach diplomatic solutions. So I think Oman and China are going to see eye to eye on many issues. And I certainly think, as I argued in the piece, there's a lot of potential for Muscat and Beijing to work together much more closely as a consequence of the chaos that the United States and Israel have unleashed in the region.
Well, Giorgio, I always appreciate you coming on and breaking this down for our audience. Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics, coming to us from Washington, D.C. Thank you so much.
Good to be with you too. Thank you.